Hello, what time is it where you are right now? Type the hour in the comments.
At my dad's retirement party, he raised his glass and said, "I'm grateful for my son, the only one who never disappointed me." I smiled, stood up, and slid a folder across the table. "Then you should probably read what he did with your pension." The room went quiet, and that was just the start. There's a particular kind of silence that hits a room when the truth walks in uninvited. It's not loud, not dramatic, not full of gasps or shrieks, but the slow, creeping stillness that makes the air feel thick, like the moment just before a summer thunderstorm cracks the sky open. That's the silence we got the second my father laid eyes on that folder I placed in front of him, right there at the head table of his retirement party. And honestly, it wasn't even a fancy folder, just a beat-up manila one I grabbed from my home office, packed tight with a few too many truths and a hell of a lot of receipts. The party had started like most of these small-town retirement parties do. Overly catered, underwhelming wine, and way too many people pretending they remembered things fondly. It was held at Hillridge Country Club, the same place Dad took us every 4th of July when I was little, back when the fireworks still amazed me, and I thought my dad was the strongest man on the planet. It hadn't changed much over the years. Still had that musty, old money smell, and the chicken marsala was still aggressively dry. But it wasn't about the food. This was about legacy. The celebration of a man who'd worked 42 years as a construction foreman, climbed his way from the bottom, raised a family, and was now supposedly entering the golden years with everything he'd earned. When I walked in, late on purpose, I already knew I wasn't going to get much eye contact. Most of the room already knew who the star was. And spoiler alert, it wasn't me. Dad was standing by the fireplace, drink in hand, surrounded by people laughing at his stories, all of which I'd heard at least 100 times before. And right next to him, grinning like he owned the place, was my brother Ben. Tall, tan, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my first car, leaning on charm like it was a family heirloom he'd inherited directly from Dad himself. Ben was always the favorite, not even in a subtle maybe I'm imagining it way, but in a very real, very public, every damn Christmas kind of way. Growing up, it was always Ben who got the bigger piece of chicken, Ben who got the new bike while I got the hand-me-down, Ben who could crash the car and still get forgiven before I even had a chance to say I told you so. He had this way of smiling just right, of apologizing without ever meaning it, of walking away from wreckage while somehow getting applauded for surviving it. Meanwhile, I was the one who stayed behind, cleaned up the messes, sat with Mom through chemo, handled the bills when Dad didn't know how, and put my own life on hold to keep the lights on. And somehow, I still ended up being the background character in a story I never asked to be part of. Anyway, back to the party. I had no intention of making a scene, not at first. The folder was in my purse the whole time. Not for theatrics, not for drama, but because I didn't trust myself to speak up without proof. And believe me, the folder had plenty of that. Screenshots, account summaries, notarized copies, even a damn paper trail from an offshore account that made me want to throw up when I first saw it. But I sat through the speeches, the fake laughs, even the slideshow Ben put together like he was running for mayor. Old pictures of Dad in his hard hat, holding Ben as a baby, Dad and Ben fishing, Dad and Ben at a Yankees game, and not a single one of me, like I was the family dog who sometimes showed up in the background. By the time Dad got up to speak, I'd already made up my mind. His voice was steady, proud, the same one he used when he gave wedding toasts or yelled across the yard. He thanked the company, thanked his crew, thanked the union, and then started in on the family. Said he was lucky to have been married to a woman like Nancy, which made a few people tear up, and I felt that in my throat too. I still missed her every day. But then he looked at Ben, not me, not even a glance, and said, "And I want to thank my son, the only one who never disappointed me." It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, like it was truth, capital T, like it was a statement everyone already knew, just waiting to be spoken aloud. So I stood up, quietly, no yelling. I didn't need drama. I just walked over, placed the folder in front of him, and said, Then you should probably read what he did with your pension. He blinked, once, twice. Then he looked down at the folder like it might bite him. He opened it, and I watched his hands tighten around the edges of the paper. The blood drained from his face. And for the first time since I was old enough to know what pain looked like, I saw my father completely, utterly lost. Ben froze. He was standing just behind Dad, and the second he saw the contents of that folder, he took a small step back, like it was instinct, like guilt finally caught up to him and smacked him square in the chest. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The people around us started whispering, nothing loud, but curious, suspicious. They'd heard the name Ben too many times tonight. They were finally wondering if maybe he wasn't the golden boy they thought he was. And Dad, well, he just kept reading, slower and slower, until he finally looked up at me with eyes that weren't angry or confused, just broken. And that was just the beginning. It had started, as these things often do, with a favor that seemed simple enough on the surface. One of those innocent requests that family members ask of each other when trust still outweighs suspicion, when a shared last name still means something solid, something binding. My father had just come out of minor back surgery, the kind that puts a 70-year-old man in a recliner for a few weeks with a heating pad and a bottle of prescription muscle relaxers. And with Mom gone for 2 years by then, and my brother conveniently too busy running his so-called investment firm out of his trendy office suite 2 towns over, it fell to me, the dependable daughter, the one who always answered the phone and never said no, to step in and help Dad with his paperwork, which included a stack of mail he hadn't opened in months and a jumble of outdated passwords written on yellowing scraps of paper stuffed into an old cigar box. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd taken care of worse. When Mom was sick, it was me who learned how to navigate insurance hell, negotiate with hospital billing offices, and find generic alternatives for medications that cost more per pill than I made in an hour. I'd cleaned up enough behind my brother by then that handling a few financial documents for Dad felt like an easy enough way to be useful. He handed me the login credentials for his retirement account with the kind of casual trust a man gives only to someone who has never once let him down. And even though he barely made eye contact while doing it, I still felt a little flicker of something, respect maybe, when he said, "Just help me make sure the pension's all set up right. Ben's already been handling most of it, but you're better at this stuff." At first, nothing looked wrong. The online dashboard showed a healthy balance, the numbers made sense, the documents looked official. It was only when I started digging into the statements, really reading them line by line, month over month, that I saw it. A series of irregular withdrawals spaced just far enough apart to avoid obvious detection, all marked as approved reallocations into private holdings that didn't seem to have names or companies attached. Just vague codes and transaction IDs that, to someone less familiar with this world, might look like routine financial maneuvering. But I had spent a decade on Wall Street before quitting that life to move back home when Mom got sick, and I knew the difference between a real investment and a shell game. This was not retirement portfolio diversification. This was theft dressed in a suit and tie. I cross-referenced the transaction codes with SEC filings, searched databases, even ran one through a friend of mine who still worked in compliance at one of the big firms. His voice dropped the second he saw what I sent. "Emily," he said, "this isn't just shady, it's criminal. These aren't real funds. These are holding pools someone created to siphon cash. I've seen this before. Small-time crooks use setups like this to pull money from unsuspecting older relatives, especially if they've got power of attorney or access to the accounts. You need to talk to your dad, like yesterday." But talking to Dad wasn't as simple as picking up the phone and explaining what I found. Because the second I even hinted that maybe Ben hadn't been completely honest, Dad shut down. He didn't want to hear it. He waved me off like I was being dramatic, too negative, reading too much into things. He said Ben was under stress, that running a firm was complicated, that maybe I was just jealous. Yes, those were his exact words. And that I should stop digging before I turned something into nothing. I should have walked away right then, spared myself the slow ache of watching the man who raised me choose denial over truth. But something about his reaction made me more certain than ever that I was on to something real. If it had just been about money, maybe I could have left it alone, chalked it up to another chapter in the long saga of Ben getting away with it again. But this wasn't pocket change or a ruined credit score. This was my father's entire pension. 40 years of hard labor, sacrificed weekends, overtime hours, calloused hands, and busted knees, all poured into a nest egg that was supposed to carry him through the final stretch of life with dignity and peace. So I didn't stop digging. I started printing everything. Every email, every statement, every record of login times and IP addresses. I bought a burner phone and used it to record a call I had with Ben, under the pretense of needing help, understanding a portfolio move Dad had mentioned. I played dumb, asked leading questions, and listened as Ben, always the showman, boasted about how Dad doesn't even look at that stuff anymore, and how we move some things around for tax reasons, and you'd be amazed how easy it is to park cash when no one's really watching. He didn't admit to stealing outright, but he didn't have to. His tone said it all. This was a man so sure of his own brilliance that he'd stopped worrying about being caught. I sent the audio to my friend. He called me the next day and said, "If you ever want to take this public, this is enough to light the match. But it's your family. Just know that once it's out, there's no putting it back in the box." For a while, I sat with that. I carried that decision around like a hot coal I couldn't put down, knowing that speaking up would burn the very ground our family stood on, but also knowing that staying silent would make me complicit in something I couldn't live with. I started noticing how often people use the word grateful around Ben. Grateful he was there for Dad. Grateful he was the one who knew business. Grateful, 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 like he was some kind of financial savior, and not the guy slowly draining my father's future behind his back. I knew what I had to do. The question was how. Because if I was going to expose him, I didn't want it to be behind closed doors. I wanted it to be undeniable, unforgettable, and right in front of the man who once told me I was too emotional to handle real money. So I waited. I waited for the perfect moment. The one where everyone would be looking in the right direction and the mask would finally slip. And as I stood in that banquet hall, watching Ben give his speech with all the polish of a used car salesman selling lies on a lease, I knew that moment was coming soon, and I would be ready. There's a certain weight that comes with being the responsible one in a family, a kind of quiet burden that isn't talked about over dinner tables or acknowledged in birthday cards, but still somehow becomes an unspoken truth that shapes every decision, every sacrifice, and every expectation placed squarely on your shoulders, whether or not you asked for it. And in our family, I wore that weight like a second skin for as long as I can remember. Though no one ever said the words directly, they didn't have to. It was clear in every sideways glance, every comment about how Ben needs a little guidance or your brother just isn't wired the same. And every time I was expected to forgive and move on while he walked away untouched, his reputation intact and his charm conveniently distracting everyone from the chaos he left in his wake. Growing up, I was the kid who followed rules not because I was afraid of punishment, but because I believed deep down that if I did everything right, eventually someone would notice. Not just notice, but really see me, see the effort, the commitment, the relentless determination to be enough. I was the one who did homework without being asked, who took on a part-time job at 16 to save for college, who brought home report cards with rows of A's and a polite smile, hoping that maybe this time someone would mention me first at the dinner table instead of asking, again, if I'd heard from Ben lately, or if I could help him clean up whatever mess he was in this time. I never rolled my eyes. I never lashed out. I just kept working harder, thinking that being good had to count for something. But Ben, he was born with that spark. The kind of effortless charisma that made teachers overlook his missing assignments and coaches ignore the fact that he skipped practice more than he showed up. He could flash that wide, crooked grin and talk himself out of anything. And when that didn't work, He'd just blame someone else and walk away like he was doing the world a favor by staying out of the spotlight. When he crashed Dad's truck into a mailbox after sneaking out with his friends, it was written off as boys being boys. When he failed out of his first semester of college, Dad said the school just wasn't the right fit. And when he borrowed money to start a business and never paid it back, they called it a learning experience. Meanwhile, I was the one who had to quietly pick up the pieces, shift money around, and make phone calls to clean up the mess while Ben basked in the glow of eternal forgiveness. The irony, of course, is that it was me who stayed close to home. When Mom got sick, it was me who took a leave of absence from work, moved back into the house, and managed her appointments, her medications, her endless list of daily needs that Dad couldn't face and Ben couldn't be bothered to understand. He sent flowers once, expensive, showy, and completely unnecessary, and told everyone at the funeral how hard it had been for him being far away, even though he never called, not once, in those last 3 weeks when she was slipping away right in front of us. I remember one night near the end, Mom's voice barely more than a whisper, when she reached out and grabbed my hand, looked at me with eyes full of something I still can't name, and said, "I know how much you've done, Emmy. I just hope he does too, someday." I squeezed her hand and told her it didn't matter, but the truth is, it did. It mattered more than I ever wanted to admit. Because after she was gone, there was no one left to see what I'd done. No one left who really remembered the way I carried this family on my back, while Ben coasted through life with applause in his ears. What made it worse was the way Dad talked about legacy after she passed, as if it were something tied to bloodlines and last names and the kind of things fathers passed down to sons without ever stopping to wonder if they deserved it. He started saying things like, "Ben's finally coming into his own," or, "He's building something, Emily, just give him a chance." And I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Dad by the shoulders and say, "He's not building anything but a lie." But I didn't. Because somewhere inside, I still thought maybe I could earn my place. Maybe I hadn't tried hard enough. Then one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table while sorting through old bills and receipts, I found a handwritten note from Dad folded behind a pile of insurance paperwork. It was addressed to Ben, and it wasn't long, just a few sentences scribbled in shaky penmanship, but the words stung like a slap to the face. "I know I haven't always been easy on you, but you're the one I count on now. You've got the name, the smarts, and the future. Keep it going, for me. No mention of me, not even a line, not even a 'tell your sister thanks.'" I folded it back up and placed it exactly where I found it, but something changed in me that day. It wasn't bitterness, not yet. It was something quieter, something colder. The slow creeping realization that no matter how much I gave, no matter how many fires I put out, I would always be the one in the shadows of someone else's myth. And that realization didn't make me cry. It made me want to win. So I stopped waiting for validation. I stopped trying to get invited into conversations that had already left me behind. Instead, I started preparing. I compiled every file, every statement, every lie Ben had slipped past Dad's blind faith, and I organized them with the precision of a surgeon and the cold clarity of someone who has spent years being invisible. Because I knew that no matter how much they adored him, the truth had sharp enough edges to cut through even the thickest fog of loyalty. I started keeping notes, not just for evidence, but for my own clarity. I wrote down every time Ben lied, every time Dad dismissed me, every moment I swallowed my pride and pretended to understand. I filled a notebook and then another, and with each page, the guilt I once felt for even thinking about exposing my brother started to fade. It wasn't betrayal, it was balance. And when the time came, I wasn't going to do it in anger. I was going to do it with precision, like a surgeon removing a tumor that had grown unchecked for far too long. Because if I was always going to be the good child, the one who never disappointed anyone, then maybe it was time I started living up to that reputation in a way they never saw coming. And this time, I wasn't going to clean up someone else's mess. I was going to expose it, publicly, permanently. And in a way, I'd make sure they finally remembered my name. There is a particular point in the unraveling of a long-held illusion when pain no longer sharpens the edges of betrayal, but instead dulls them into something harder, colder, and far more calculated. A space where emotion steps aside and makes room for precision. A kind of methodical determination that doesn't burn hot, but simmers with intention, where every move is measured, every word rehearsed, and every action designed not just to reveal the truth, but to expose it in a way that it cannot be ignored, denied, or buried beneath decades of misdirected loyalty and generational blindness. It was somewhere in that space that I found myself in the weeks leading up to my father's retirement party, not angry anymore, not even heartbroken, but quietly resolved to do what had to be done because the story my family believed about itself could no longer be left to rot untouched while the lies festered under the surface like mold behind wallpaper. By then, I knew the scope of it all, not just the missing pension funds or the falsified documents, but the full reach of my brother's carefully constructed web of deceit, which, in true Ben fashion, had been dressed up in enough buzzwords, financial jargon, and charming half-truths to pass muster with anyone too polite or too trusting to look closer. What started as a few irregular account reallocations had ballooned into a shell structure of fake investments, made-up LLCs, and even a fabricated online dashboard that displayed doctored balances, all of which were meant to reassure my father that his retirement nest egg was safe, growing, and well-managed under Ben's expert care, when, in reality, that money had long since been rerouted into ventures designed to prop up Ben's ego and keep the illusion of his financial success alive just a little longer. The most infuriating part was how easy it had been for him, how seamlessly he'd exploited our father's faith, using the same name, the same voice, the same last-minute apologies that had gotten him through every other crisis he'd manufactured since we were kids. It wasn't that Ben was smarter than everyone else. It was that he knew exactly where the cracks were, the soft spots in people's faith, the vulnerabilities in trust that could be manipulated without resistance. He had always known that Dad wanted to believe in him so badly that he would ignore any evidence to the contrary, if it meant holding on to the fantasy that his only son had finally turned his life around. So I planned the reveal not as an act of revenge, at least not at first, but as an act of clarity, a painful necessity that might finally break the spell and allow everyone, especially my father, to see what I had seen for far too long. I couldn't do it alone, though. There were layers to peel back, legal red tape to navigate, and for that I needed someone with expertise in the language of financial misconduct, someone who had seen through scams like this before and could help me build a case that wasn't just emotionally compelling, but legally airtight. That someone turned out to be a retired IRS auditor named Sheila Torres, a woman I had met years ago at a finance conference, the kind of sharp, no-nonsense professional who could sniff out a fraudulent tax shelter from 20 feet away and who didn't blink twice when I laid out the situation over coffee, one cold February morning. She listened, barely interrupting, then pulled out a yellow legal pad and began outlining what she called the framework of exposure, which sounded clinical but turned out to be exactly what I needed. A step-by-step plan to collect, organize, and present the information in a way that could not be disputed or deflected, even by someone as slippery as my brother. With Sheila's help, I gathered everything: the forged authorization forms bearing Dad's shaky signature, the inconsistent digital login records that showed Ben accessing the retirement account from his office. At times he claimed to be out of state, the phony investment prospectuses filled with vague language and boilerplate risk disclaimers. We pulled financial records that traced the money through a series of transfers, ultimately landing in an account linked to a new startup Ben had launched under a friend's name, supposedly a real estate innovation firm. Though as far as we could tell, it had no assets, no operations, and no employees. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. Ben had siphoned off nearly $400,000 over the span of 18 months, masked it under the illusion of diversification, and gambled it away on a series of failed ventures that had nothing to do with retirement planning and everything to do with ego, pride, and the desperate desire to look successful. I knew, of course, that presenting this information quietly wouldn't be enough. If I handed it to Dad in private, he'd confront Ben. Ben would deny it, spin a story, and somehow walk away with Dad comforting him for the stress of being accused. No, it had to be public. It had to happen when the illusion was at its most convincing, when everyone was watching, when the spotlight was firmly fixed on Ben's carefully curated image of loyalty, success, and redemption. Only then would the truth land with enough force to shatter the illusion completely. So I chose the retirement party. It was perfect, really. A catered celebration held in the banquet hall of the Hillridge Country Club, with Dad's old coworkers, extended family, and all of Ben's business connections present. It would be the culmination of Dad's career, a moment designed to honor his legacy, and more importantly, a platform for Ben to bask in the reflected glory of being the good son, the one who took care of things, while the rest of us fell behind. And I would be there, not with a speech or a toast, but with a folder full of truth, waiting for the exact moment when Dad's pride reached its peak, when the room was hanging on his every word, and when Ben's smile was stretched just wide enough to cover the panic beneath. The night before the party, I barely slept, not because I was nervous, but because the weight of what I was about to do had finally settled in. Not the fear of fallout, but the certainty that everything would change once the truth was out. Relationships, reputations, the fragile family myth we'd all clung to for too long. They would all be irrevocably altered. But what kept me focused wasn't anger or vindication. It was something quieter, the memory of Mom, lying in her hospital bed, telling me that she hoped one day Ben would understand what I had done for this family. And maybe he never would, but Dad would. That morning, I packed the folder, ironed my dress, and looked at myself in the mirror with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about setting the record straight, about finally turning the lights on in a room that had been kept dark for far too long. And as I zipped up my purse and stepped out the door, my phone buzzed with a message from Sheila. He just moved another $50,000 into the Shell account. It's time. I didn't reply. I didn't need to because I already knew this was it, and I was ready. There's a strange kind of stillness that comes just before a moment you know it's going to change everything. An almost cinematic slowness where every detail feels too vivid, too sharp, like the universe is holding its breath and waiting to see what you're going to do with the weight of the truth in your hands. A truth that's been burning a hole through your conscience for far too long. That's what I felt as I stood at the back of the banquet hall, heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet, fingers curled around the worn manila folder I'd carried like a weapon sheathed in silence, watching as my father, proud and unsuspecting, stood in front of his gathered friends, co-workers, and extended family, raising a glass to a life of work, sacrifice, and what he believed to be enduring loyalty from the people who surrounded him. The crowd had grown warm with the kind of artificial joy that clings to well-dressed gatherings. The champagne flowed, the speeches echoed with practiced sentiment. And Ben, of course, had already made his round of back-patting appearances, smiling wide, shaking hands with men who mistook confidence for integrity, and laughing just loud enough to draw attention, but not so loud as to appear self-congratulatory. He'd positioned himself close to Dad, right by the podium, poised as if the night was as much about him as it was about the man we were there to honor. And maybe in his mind maybe Ben truly believed he had orchestrated the whole thing, that he had managed to not only steal from our father, but to sell it back to him as love, as success, as legacy wrapped in a custom-tailored suit and polished charm. I waited until Dad's speech had reached the part I knew was coming. The part I had heard rehearsed a dozen times over the last month in one form or another, where he always brought it back to family, to what really mattered, to how proud he was of the life he had built. And then, right on cue, he turned to Ben with that same soft look that had always made me feel like an outsider, and he said it, the line that still echoed in my ears, even though I had braced myself for it. And to my son, he said, voice rich with conviction, the only one who never disappointed me. Thank you, Ben, for taking care of me when I needed it most. The room erupted in polite applause, a few nods of admiration, maybe even a tear or two from the more sentimental attendees. But I didn't clap. I didn't smile. I took a slow step forward, then another, until I was close enough to see the exact moment my father's eyes registered my presence. The faint crease of confusion in his brow, the slight tightening of his jaw when he realized I wasn't coming up to offer a toast or a hug, or some long-awaited approval. Instead, I placed the folder in front of him, my hands steady despite the thundering of my heart, and I said calmly, clearly, and without hesitation, "Then you should probably read what he did with your pension." You could feel the room shift. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, wine glasses lowered, and even the waitstaff froze in place as my father opened the folder and began to flip through the neatly organized pages. Documents that told a story too ugly to be denied, a story written in stolen digits and fraudulent signatures, of savings siphoned off and lies dressed up as business strategies. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of paper rustling and the dull hum of the ceiling lights overhead. Ben stepped forward like he wanted to speak, like he was preparing to play the part he always played, the misunderstood genius, the victim of miscommunication, the man with a plan, but I was faster. I pulled my phone from my pocket, tapped once, and let the recording play. His voice, smooth and cocky, filled the silence as he laughed on the line, with someone we'd never identified, saying, "Dad's never going to notice. He doesn't look past the top line. I could empty the whole damn thing, and he'd still toast me at the party." There was a gasp then, maybe from Aunt Laura or someone from Dad's union group, but I kept my eyes on my father, watched the slow crumbling of belief in his expression, the way his shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in something more painful, disillusionment. He looked at me, and for the first time in what felt like years, really looked at me, with eyes no longer clouded by expectation or assumption. Ben started speaking, his voice louder now, desperate, the confidence slipping. He said it wasn't what it looked like, that I'd misunderstood, that I was twisting things out of context. But I didn't even need to respond. The evidence was sitting inches from Dad's hands, undeniable and complete. Sheila had helped me structure it so thoroughly that even a courtroom couldn't have picked it apart. And if my father had been blind before, now he had no choice but to see. He didn't say anything right away. He simply closed the folder, placed it gently on the table, and turned away from Ben, not in rage but with a weariness that struck me harder than any explosion of anger could have. It was the kind of silence that came from the breaking of something foundational, something sacred, trust, maybe, or hope, or both. I didn't expect applause. I didn't want it. What I wanted was acknowledgement, not of the damage Ben had done, but of what I had carried in the years. Everyone else had chosen to look the other way. And so, before the whispers could start again, I said one last thing, not to the room, not to the guests, but to my father, who still hadn't looked away from that folder. "I stayed," I said. "Through everything, I stayed. I cleaned up the messes, I handled the care, I did the work that no one saw, and I never asked for anything. But tonight, I'm asking you to see this. Not because it makes me better than him, but because it's the truth, and I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter." There was no answer, just that same heavy silence. Ben had already slipped toward the exit, eyes wild, face pale, murmuring to someone on his phone. He didn't try to apologize, not really. He knew there was no coming back from this. Not tonight, not ever. I left before the end of the party, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor, the sound oddly satisfying, like the punctuation on a story that had been waiting far too long to be told. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty and full at once, as if years of being unheard had suddenly collapsed into a single moment of brutal clarity. The next day, I didn't get a call from Dad. I didn't expect one. I knew it would take time for the dust to settle, for the shape of the truth to take hold. But I also knew that whatever came next, The myth had been broken. The lie was dead. And in the quiet that followed, I finally heard something I'd been waiting to hear for decades. Not words, not applause, but silence on my own terms. Because I didn't do it to be the good child anymore. I did it because I got tired of being invisible. And now, whether they liked it or not, they finally had to see me.